Larry David asked Larry Charles to come work with him on Seinfeld, and it's no surprise he wanted him back for Curb. Here's Larry Charles.
Jim?
I can't thank you enough.
You can't? Oh, sure you can.
Well, bullshit aside, I woke up this morning with a little spring in my step because I was so looking forward to this.
Great. Well, I'm happy to satisfy your desires.
I think we should start with how you met Larry.
Very, very simple but dramatic tale. I was a 22-year-old kid who didn't know how to get into show business, quit NYU Film School, went out to California. I really didn't know how to start. And I had always read that Woody Allen used to write freelance jokes and sell them for like $10 a piece to various people. Earl Wilson, who was a columnist in New York at that time, another, kind of like middle-level comedians. And I thought, I could do that. I could write jokes. And so I was a parking valet in Los Angeles, and when I get off from work, I would have these jokes, and this is before computers, and I still write longhand, as does Larry. And I would write out jokes, a page of handwritten jokes, and I would go stand in front of the Comedy Store, which happened to be a very fertile time for the Comedy Store. Richard Pryor was trying out his material for his concert movies, and Robin Williams was starting out there.
So what year are we talking about, basically?
We're talking about I would say 76, 77, 78, somewhere around there. David Letterman and Jay Leno were sort of the kings, the co-kings of the Comedy Store at that time. They were considered the two funniest comedians. But nobody was really earning a living, and so you would hope to get latched on to somebody who was doing very well, like Jimmy Walker, Dynamite Walker. He was like a very successful comedian at that time because he had a TV show. And so Letterman, Leno, all those guys were on his writing staff. So there was this whole hierarchy that I was trying to break into. And I started standing in front of the Comedy Store, and when I recognized a comedian like Jay Leno, I'd say, hey, you want to buy a joke? And people started buying my jokes. They started getting laughs. I started getting $10 a piece.
Do you remember any?
Yeah. I wrote one about, you might recognize me as a child actor. I played the embryo in 2001. Things like that. And they were like, just kind of sharp one-liners along that Woody Allen kind of approach. I hadn't really been thinking about being a writer in any serious way or developing routines or monologues. I was just desperately trying to get in, just get in there. So this comedian started buying my material, a guy named Darryl Igus. And to make a long story short, he, like a year later or so, got a job on this TV show Fridays. And he recommended me to the show. And I actually hitchhiked to the interview, also with handwritten material, came into the meeting and was very brash in the meeting because I just couldn't imagine I was going to get the job. And at the end, I did very well in the meeting. And at the end, I said, look, I don't know what made me say this, by the way. I can't imagine saying it today. But I said, look, I don't really care if I get this job. What I care about is don't fuck me over, Just let me know one way or the other if I have the job. Don't string it out. Don't play me. Just let me know the truth. I can handle it. So they said, okay, and I hitchhiked back home. I went back to my apartment that I was sharing with another guy. And when I got back, I got a phone call from Jack Burns saying I have good news and bad news. The good news is I'm getting back to you quickly. The bad news is you're hired. So I got hired onto that show, and Larry David was one of the actor-writers on that show, along with Michael Richards and a bunch of other very, very talented, very nice people. But Larry and I were from the same neighborhood. He was about 10 years older than me. I was like the oldest kid, in my family. So, older brothers are always looking for like some kind of mentor figure. And he immediately he was the younger brother in his family. So he immediately took me under his wing. We were from the same neighborhood, had similar sensibilities in many ways, not always, but many ways. And he became kind of like an older brother mentor figure to me from the very beginning. We wrote together, we hung out together, and that's how I met him, basically. And that's how our friendship formed also, was in the cauldron of that live TV show.
And then you were obviously part of Seinfeld for, the first 5 seasons?
I think, again, it's very confusing to me the way they broke it down, but I think I did 80 episodes. Right. Whether that's 4 seasons or 5 seasons, whether you count that 4 episode season as a season. I'm just not sure, but yes, about 80 episodes, right from almost the very beginning, right after those 4 shows, because they wouldn't hire me. Larry wanted to hire me right from the beginning, but he had never done a sitcom, and I had never done a sitcom. And he was not in charge of the show yet at that point. There were still people kind of supervising him. So they refused to hire me because I had no sitcom experience. But also keep in mind, if I may, that between Fridays, which ends about 82 or something, and Seinfeld, which is, like 8 years later, or whatever it is, 7 years later, he and I are both like extremely unemployed most of the time and kind of looking out for each other and turning each other on to little gigs here and there and sort of staying connected, but with no real illusions or ambitions of success. I mean, we're both struggling and having no kind of inroads in how to accomplish this. I mean, this is when he eventually wound up working. He went back to New York and wound up working on Saturday Night Live, which was, part of the disaster that kind of fueled his coming back to Jerry and doing the show. So yeah, we were connected through that entire time that we were unemployed. And then when Seinfeld came up, he actually came to me. He gave me the first 4 scripts to read. I remember he came out here, and he was at the Bellage Hotel, and he gave me like the first 4 scripts, which included the Chinese restaurant and the ex-boyfriend and mail unbonding, and there was another one too, maybe the robbery or the ex-girlfriend. I can't remember all of them, but I remember sitting in the lobby of the hotel and just reading those 4 scripts and going, oh my God, this is hilarious. I could not believe how funny it was. Amongst the funniest things I'd ever read. And I was very excited, and then I couldn't work on the show until after those first 4, and then the show got picked up for that first 13.
Are you ready to make your next move? Well, Squarespace wants to be with you when you do. Squarespace gives people a powerful and beautiful online platform from which to make their next move known to the world. With Squarespace, people can lock down their ideas with a unique domain, create a website to launch their idea, a portfolio to get their project out there, and an online store to officially open for business. There's so much that Squarespace can do for you. So what are you waiting for? Make your next move with Squarespace. Create a beautiful website or online store with award-winning templates. There's nothing to install, patch, or upgrade, ever. And Squarespace offers award-winning 24/7 customer support with fully transparent and simple to execute setup. Squarespace is used by a wide range of creatives, people, and businesses. Use offer code ORIGINS for 10% off your first purchase of a website and domain. That's offer code ORIGINS. And make your next move with Squarespace. So, were you aware that Larry had wanted to go back into stand-up and was doing this documentary for HBO? I mean, you guys were still in touch.
Yeah, I mean, we had talked over the years, about his desires and his frustrations with Seinfeld, even though he was very happy with it. I think he sort of had a kind of a vision of himself as a performer. He had been a great cult comedian back in New York and even in Los Angeles, like a comedian's comedian. And I think he felt that he never really fully fulfilled that ambition. So I think he had been thinking about how to do it in a way that he'd have a little more control over than he had before. I mean, I'm sure you've heard from him probably, and from others, all the legendary stories of his Johnny Rotten-like stage behavior in those days when he would spit on the audience or throw the mic down or come out and just, before he even uttered a word, change his mind and walk off stage. I mean, those are great stories.
Legendary.
I witnessed a number of those things. So I think he wanted to do it in a kind of a more controlled atmosphere, like a more theater atmosphere where people came to see him. And I think after Seinfeld, he felt he might have that form there. He might have the venue to be able to control the circumstances so people were coming to see him. And then I guess out of that idea, filming that Odyssey, came the idea for the show. And
did he approach you then as soon as he decided to take the documentary down the series path? Did he say to you, can you be involved?
He did, and in fact, I would make even a more profound statement, which was he basically made me a director. Because by that time in my life, I had ambitions to direct. I mean, like almost everybody else. And I was kind of, being from Brooklyn, frankly, I was very embarrassed to voice these ambitions. I thought, oh, everybody says that. It's like such a cliche. I can't bring myself to say I want to be a director. I really couldn't, you know. So when he decided to do the show, he just turned to me one day and said, you know, you should direct one of these. And I was like, okay. And that started my directing career. So that's how responsible. I often say Larry David is probably the most important person in my adult life, the most influential person in my adult life. And it's because of things like that. Hey, you want to work on this show? You know, because Seinfeld even, he was like, hey, why don't you come work on the show? We'll do 13 episodes. It'll get canceled. We'll have a good time. We'll make a little money. That's how Seinfeld was approached, you know. And Curb Your Enthusiasm was, hey, why don't you direct one of these? And I was like, okay. And suddenly I was a director. So I'm extremely in debt, grateful to Larry for the profound effect he's had on my adult life.
Well, it's interesting because directing a Curb episode is somewhat of an outlier compared to directing a traditional sitcom. And so for that to be your first endeavor, could you talk a little bit about that?
It was a challenge that for whatever reason my background really lent itself to, you know. I don't know if I would have been a good sitcom director. You know, I was a showrunner on Mad About You. One of the reasons he thought I'd be a good director on this was because I would be at the Seinfeld rehearsals with him going, you know, we should get a close-up here. Or, you know, you want a reaction shot from Michael, or, you know, whatever that kind of stuff was. And I'd sit in editing with him quite often to sort of look at angles and try to kind of put together the sequences. So I think he saw that I had that sense about me, you know. But again, I hadn't directed anything, and I really didn't know how to direct anything. I didn't even know how to start. Like, how do you set up the camera? What's the first thing you say when you walk? I mean, little things like that I just didn't know anything about, and I just kind of followed my instincts, which for that show was perfect, you know, because it's really about following the action almost journalistically, you know, and kind of edging the action towards certain heights and certain performance heights. And I knew what was funny, and I knew how to get the best out of Larry. And I think Elaine Julie is actually a guest on that episode too, and I knew her pretty well. So I felt comfortable with the people to a large degree. But still, technically, I was like, apparently I was a disaster. I mean, a lot of people call me LC. They call Larry LD. They call me LC. And on the set, they were constantly calling me LC. And years later, the AD told me that it was like a little in-joke, actually, because for them, for the crew, LC meant line cross, because I didn't understand the concept of crossing the line in cinematography, you know. So they were kind of making a joke at my expense by calling me LC. and my response to that, which would be the same today, is Jean-Luc Godard broke those laws. Everybody's broken those laws. Those rules are ridiculous. You don't have to follow those rules. And, of course, nobody follows those rules anymore. They're constantly broken. We accept that as part of the common film language now.
When you directed Borat, it was kind of like a festival of broken rules, right?
Well, yes. I mean, that had a certain philosophy to it. I mean, with Borat, we were like, well, what would it be like if Kazakhstani cameramen actually filmed this? Like, what would that look like, you know? And so that meant, like, bad framing, bad compositions, cameras kind of drifting. You know, that was kind of a very purposeful aesthetic, you know?
Parachute sheets are the softest and most comfortable sheets you'll ever own. And why is that? Well, simply put, it's because they're made from the very best fabrics. Parachute sheets have a clean, minimalistic style that come in neutral colors, so they work perfect in any bedroom. And the best part of Parachute is that their sheets get softer with time. Plus, if you're a person who wants to make an impact on the world, and frankly, who doesn't, then Parachute is the company for you. They've partnered with the United Nations Foundation to donate malaria prevention bed nets, and they've already donated 16,000 so far. Here's another great part of the story. Parachute offers a 60-night trial, so if you don't love your sheets, you just send them back, no questions asked. Now, if you're wondering how that makes a positive impact on the world, well, all returns are donated to Habitat for Humanity, and that's a great cause. So don't wait. Visit parachutehome.com/origins for free shipping and returns. Again, that's parachutehome.com/origins for free shipping and returns. It doesn't get any easier. It's time to get better sleep with Parachute. Could you talk a little bit about the improv nature, though, particularly when you were directing? When I interviewed Cheryl Hines, she said that there's no way she could have done the show without her background, obviously, in the Groundlings. And could you just talk about directing when there isn't a script that's telling everybody where this is going and what they should say?
Well, it was a great kind of freedom, because I think one of the misconceptions about something like Curb is that it was just a free for all, and we would just, like, the actors would get in front of the camera and the director would be behind the camera, and we would just say action, and people would just improvise the scene. But that wasn't the way it was at all. Larry David is a writer and a structuralist, a very disciplined structuralist. So the outlines for Curb were very, very specific. There was a sense of exactly where the scene had to go to nail the scene. Like, certain points had to be made, occasionally even a line that had to be said. So we kind of knew where we were heading. And then the shooting of the scenes became kind of like the rewrites. You would do a version of the scene, certain things were missed or certain dynamics were not achieved. You would try to make adjustments to that and do that scene again. And because everybody was so skilled, within 4 or 5 takes, you had this kind of heightened, funniest version of the scene, and then you had enough coverage, because we kept the coverage as minimal and as simple as possible to just capture the performances, and which became a visual style for that show also, ironically. And so it kind of built on this essential structure, and then everything was kind of added to that structure until you had a scene that would connect to the scene before it and the scene after it. And that, both Larry and I, as writers, were very, very conscious of that structure, and maintaining that structure, even though part of the joy of doing something like Curb is the surprise and the discovery of not knowing what's going to happen, and somebody coming up with something that is just golden that could never have been written, and that happened just all the time, which was fantastic.
I believe you directed a total of 17 episodes of Curb, and I was just wondering, is there a scene in one of those episodes that you remember because it was either so funny or so great, or it enabled you to do something that you really wanted to do in the episode?
Well, the thing that, the episode that pops into my mind when you ask that question is an episode called The Survivor.
Oh, my God.
We had a Holocaust survivor, and we had a contestant from the Survivor TV show. And this is to me, again, a great illustration of Larry's genius. Like, even looking back at the contest, he's able to take the darkest subjects you could imagine, the most uncomedic subjects you could imagine, and just by angling it slightly differently, finding a way into those subjects that was funny and not offensive. In a weird way, he'd be able to deal with something like the Holocaust. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a 9/11 storyline in there, too, about the rabbi whose brother died on 9/11, but it turns out he was actually run over by a bicycle, on uptown on 9/11. It had nothing to do with actual 9/11 event.
Larry's face when he says that, and he realizes that he had said his brother is dead on 9/11, but not part of the awful tragedy, is one of the great shots of the entire series.
It's fantastic. I agree. I mean, again, behind the camera, I am enjoying that as much as the audience is, and which is a good signal for me that I'm actually having glee at that moment. So that scene and the scene at the dinner table when the Holocaust survivor and the survivor contestant get into the argument about who suffered more.
I mean, that was really tricky.
Thinking, God, I'm in a world here that nobody else is in. This is we're dealing with subject matter in comedy that is untouched by anyone ever. And I felt really privileged, and I felt really exhilarated and excited by that. And I was amazed. Even as I was directing it, I was amazed. And everybody committed to it. I think the Survivor contestant was named Corey. I can't remember the other actor's name, who was a blacklisted actor, by the way. And I can't remember his name. Forgive me for that. But everybody was really into it. And that scene we did that scene again and again until it really kind of reached that kind of climax. If I'm not mistaken, the wine gets spilled. There's all but it was one of those singular scenes, as was the scene with the rabbi. So I thought, this is very, very special. This is unique. This only could be done on Curb. And that's kind of like another criteria that Larry set up that I have followed through my life. If it could be done somewhere else, we shouldn't be doing it on Seinfeld. If it could be done somewhere else, we shouldn't be doing it on Curb. And that's pretty much the criteria that led to so many incredible stories and funny moments, you know.
When you look back on Curb, how much, I mean, it is seriously one of my favorite shows ever. And the idea that it's coming back for a 9th season is both remarkable and it's just so fantastic. But how different is Curb in the context of the history of television comedic shows?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, you know, just like Seinfeld, they are groundbreaking shows, and yet, if you're a student of comedy, which you are and I am, you know it's part of a continuum as well. So TV, from the very beginning, had great comedy stars, Burns and Allen, Danny Thomas, you know, whoever it was, Joey Bishop, you know, I mean, Bill Cosby, you know, all did shows that were sort of based around their lives, their personas, some sort of kind of, in some ways, like the Burns and Allen show where they're talking to the camera, very breakthrough kind of stuff. But again, a comedian with a vision doing a great show that's sort of based on their life in some way. So there is that precedent for that, you know. And I think Seinfeld really was kind of born out of that. And also our love for those older shows, like Sergeant Bilko was a big influence on us, and Abbott and Costello was a big influence on us. So there were things that just used to make us laugh out loud, the shared reference of guys that age, you know, from that kind of background. But we understood the precedents. We understood the examples that preceded us, and we respected them, and we ingested them and absorbed them. And, you know, we did a kind of a postmodern version with Seinfeld. Curb takes it that one step further. Curb is, you know, Seinfeld is like pre-cable, and Curb is like post-cable. And in the post-cable world, you know, again, just like a lot of things fell together for Seinfeld to become Seinfeld, a lot of things fell together for Curb to be Curb. You know, it helped that the head of HBO at that time knew Larry very well and had been a bartender at the Improv when Larry used to perform, and they were also open to this idea of doing the show improv style because basically Larry did not want to memorize lines, you know. So a lot of inadvertent elements came together and synthesized correctly in this particular case, which isn't always the case, as we see many shows fall by the wayside. Look, we were losing on Seinfeld. We were losing in the ratings, both to Jake and the Fat Man, but also to Richard Lewis's show, his attempt at his version of that. And eventually that got turned around, of course. So I think I think they're both groundbreaking shows, Seinfeld and Curb. And I think Larry and Jerry are both like visionaries of comedy. But I think part of their visionary outlook is the awareness of what's come before them, you know?
Yeah, they're both very respectful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this Origins original. Please be sure to subscribe to Origins for new chapters every month, along with other Origins originals and Origins conversations. Thanks so much. For Origins, I'm Jim Miller.